If China tries to invade Taiwan, will the United States be able to prevent it? And if so, at what cost? What are the key factors and events that will determine success or failure? What lessons can we learn from Ukraine? A study by CSIS was done to find out. They conducted 24 different wargames, some of them with more basic assumptions, and some of them with a more pessimistic or optimistic spin on events. In this video, we will take a look at the invasion itself, the sequence of events, the crucial role of Japan, the Ukraine model, who will help the United States, cost, outcome, and recommendations for the United States and its military. So let's start to take a look at the invasion itself. The CSIS expects that the Chinese invasion will start with a massive bombardment by Chinese air and missile forces on Taiwan, especially on Taiwan's Air Force and Navy. Now the PLA Navy, which is the People Liberations Army Navy, it's Chinese Navy, will then encircle the island to prevent any ships and aircraft from entering Taiwan. Next, a fleet of amphibious transport ships will cross the Taiwan Strait and will bring thousands of Chinese soldiers onto the beaches of Taiwan. Meanwhile, PLA airborne troops are parachuted onto the island to help establish a secure beachhead. Now the key for the Chinese is that this beachhead will include the capture of ports and airfields, because these are essential for enabling and speeding up the offloading of more soldiers and heavy equipment, such as tanks and artillery. Now the Taiwanese army will react quickly to the invasion and will try to prevent the Chinese from gaining a secure foothold. Taiwan's armed forces will move to the beachheads to prevent a further advance and to ultimately drive the enemy back. Now, in all these war games, the United States joins in to fight alongside Taiwan against China. Now, the focus of the United States is to destroy the Chinese invasion fleet, because without sufficient ships to reinforce and supply the Chinese forces on Taiwan, the invasion will be doomed to fail. The US will also carry out limited strikes against the Chinese mainland, focusing on air bases and ports that are involved in the invasion. Most likely there will be no extensive bombing campaign directed against Chinese infrastructure. Now the reasons for this are fear of escalation, the high cost to the US Air Force given the effectiveness of China's integrated air defense system, and another reason why the United States will be unlikely to conduct a heavy bombing campaign against the Chinese mainland is that the war over Taiwan itself will demand so much from US forces and stockpile of weapons that there will be not enough left for the United States to also conduct a extensive bombing campaign of China itself. Japan's crucial role. The United States must use its military bases in Japan. This means that Japan is crucial to a US victory. If the United States Navy and Air Force are not allowed to operate from bases in Japan, they will be far less effective, because US bases in Japan, especially those on Okinawa, are much closer to Taiwan than US bases elsewhere in the Pacific, such as on Guam or South Korea, Hawaii, and other places. Japan's participation, however, is not ensured, mainly because the Japanese constitution puts limits on what the Japanese military can do. But most likely the United States will be allowed to use its military bases in Japan for operations against China. And in case of a Chinese attack against those bases, Japan will most likely join the fight, and it will allow its military to carry out offensive operations against China. China has a Japan dilemma. So in most war games, the United States used its bases in Japan to build up forces and then attack Chinese targets. Well, although the Chinese players in these war games were hesitant to attack US bases in Japan, when the United States started to use these bases for offensive military operations, these bases became targets for Chinese missiles. An interesting thing is that these missile strikes against US bases in Japan led to the destructions of hundreds of US and Japanese aircraft on the ground that were not in fortified hangars. In fact, most of the airplanes that were lost during the conflict over Taiwan on the US and Japanese sides were aircraft that were stationed, that were sitting on the ground while their airfield was being attacked by Chinese missiles. Now, according to the wargame, the benefits to China of attacking US military bases in Japan outweigh the cost, which is that Japan will join the war. The Ukraine model. One of the more interesting conclusions of this wargame is that the United States should not count on a Ukraine model to deal with the conflict over Taiwan. So the US approach to the war in Ukraine is to supply Ukraine with weapon systems and money, to train Ukrainian forces, and to provide intelligence and other services that will help the Ukrainian army in the fight against the Russian military. Now, CSIS makes it very clear that this approach cannot work for Taiwan, and the reason is simple. So one of the first things that China will do is to surround the island and to prevent any ships and airplanes from entering Taiwan. So this means it will be impossible or otherwise highly costly for the United States to try and bring in men and material during the conflict. So in one of the war games, the US players, they tried to move a US Army brigade into Taiwan by air. And in the process, 2/3 of the force, approximately 2,000 soldiers, died because their airplanes were being shot down by Chinese missiles and fighter aircraft. So this means that the United States cannot implement the Ukraine model. So instead, the United States should arm Taiwan with as many weapons as it can before the war begins. And when the conflict does begin, the United States military, especially its air, missile, and naval forces, they should directly participate in the war. And they should join the fight quickly, because the longer the United States waits, the more forces and material China will have moved onto Taiwan, and the more likely it is that China will win. Who will help the United States? Now, the CSIS expects that most countries in the region, that is East Asia, Southeast Asia, will decide to remain neutral. So they will not join the war on the US or Chinese side. Now, the main reason is that many of these countries, they have extensive economic relations with China, which they want to maintain. They also understand that China is a strong power right on their doorstep, and that the United States is a distant power. So this means they will be hesitant in allying themselves with the United States against China. Now, NATO support is also unclear. Most European nations, they have limited interest in the Pacific that they feel needs protection. Many European countries also have extensive trade relations with China. So the CSIS expects that the European nations are either not willing and otherwise not able to send their militaries to the region to fight against China. They do expect that Europe will impose economic sanctions on China. Perhaps Britain or France, which have a history in the region and also have military forces capable of operating in far away theaters. They may decide to send a few ships, for example, but these will not have a decisive impact on the outcome of the battle. The cost. The cost of the war will be high for all sides. No matter the outcome, in all the war games, the United States suffered heavy casualties, and so did Taiwan, China, and also Japan, if the latter decides to fight as well. On average, the United States will lose 2 of its aircraft carriers, dozens of other large warships like destroyers and cruisers, hundreds of aircraft, and between 6 to 10,000 casualties in the first 4 weeks of the war alone. The average number of killed per day in these war games was around 140. And to make a comparison, during the height of the Iraq and Afghanistan war, the average number of US soldiers killed was around 3. During the Vietnam War, this was around 30 killed a day. And during the Second World War, 300 killed a day. Now, interestingly, most aircraft will be lost on the ground when Chinese missiles will strike US air bases in Japan, in Guam, and in other places in the Pacific. In fact, most or maybe all of US bases in the Pacific region will be attacked if those bases are used by the United States in the war against China. And this will weaken the US position for many years because some of the losses in men and also material will not be easily replaced. So the CSIS expects that of the hundreds of aircraft lost, it may take a couple of years to rebuild all those lost aircraft and to train new pilots. But especially for large surface ships and also aircraft carriers, it may take decades to rebuild them. So a conflict over Taiwan will weaken the US position in the Pacific for a very long time. When it comes to the number of people killed or wounded, the CSIS also mentions that it's important that the American public is prepared for this, because they expect that that the United States will suffer in a few weeks about half as many casualties as in 20 years of war in Afghanistan and Iraq. Taiwan's military will also be degraded and Taiwan's economy severely damaged. And given Taiwan's important global role in certain technologies like semiconductors, the CSIS expects that the entire world will feel the effects. When it comes to China, the Chinese Navy, especially its amphibious force, will be broken in case of defeat and otherwise seriously reduced in case of a Chinese victory. Thousands of soldiers will die, and if the PLA loses the fight, tens of thousands will be captured as prisoners of war. Japan, if it decides to join the battle, will have much of its air force and navy destroyed. The outcome. Now, in most war games, China lost, or it ended up in some sort of a stalemate. In only a few war games, China managed to win, especially when the United States decided not to get involved. Now, the reasons are for this poor outcome from the Chinese side is that the CSIS expects a strong resistance of Taiwan's army. relentless air and missile attacks against the Chinese beachhead and its ports and airfields, which will make it very difficult to supply and reinforce. Destruction of the Chinese amphibious fleet, which also makes it very difficult to supply and reinforce. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, CSIS concludes that an amphibious invasion is always going to be very difficult, even in the best of circumstances. You have to establish a beachhead, you have to secure them, you have to constantly supply and reinforce over a long distance, over water or the air. And then you have to move further inland, which in Taiwan's case is very difficult given the geography of the island. So the inner island has a lot of mountains, which makes it more easily to defend and more difficult to capture. And on the outsides of the island, you do have narrow stretches of more flat land near the coast, which allows for easier movement. But because these are only quite narrow and most cities are there, it means that for Taiwan's army, they can build many fortifications and they will still be able to defend it quite well. Recommendations. Based on the 24 wargames, the CSIS makes the following recommendations in order to make a US victory more likely. The first is to strengthen Taiwan's military, especially its ground forces, because they will have to contain the beachheads and carry out counterattacks to defeat the Chinese army, which has landed on Taiwan. The second recommendation is that the United States must hit the Chinese fleet hard and without much delay, and that the United States will need a large stockpile of long-range anti-ship cruise missiles. The third recommendation is that the United States must use its bases in Japan. Japan is crucial to a US victory. If the United States Navy and Air Force are not allowed to operate from bases in Japan, the United States will most likely be unable to defeat China. Another recommendation is that the United States Navy should shift its composition of its forces, its ships, to a higher number of smaller vessels instead of a lower number of bigger and more powerful ships. And the reason is that big surface ships are vulnerable to missile strikes, and China has a enormous stockpile of such missiles, which can be used to sink surface ships. The final recommendation is that the United States should have more attack submarines, because in all the war games, these attack submarines were very effective in sinking Chinese ships. So that is it. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure to like and subscribe, and see you next time.